Without further ado, a warm welcome to Dr. Brian Wilson, a distinguished faculty scholar at Western. A little bit about Brian. He's a native of Santa Clara, California. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Medical Microbiology from Stanford University and spent 3 years in the Peace Corps in Honduras and Dominican Republic. Went on to earn a master's degree in Hispanic Studies and an MA and PhD in Religious Studies from the University of California in Santa Barbara. He joined the faculty at Western Michigan in 1996 and is an expert in areas including American religious history, religious movements, religion and medicine, and spiritual biography. I think I'm going to leave it to the doctor here to tell us more about spiritualism in his talk, but just a warm welcome here to Brian Wilson today. I'm going to pass the...
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming today. This is great. Yeah, full house. To come out on a Tuesday morning like this is, yeah, really heartening for a historian like me. So I want to thank Eric and Tony for the invitation to come and talk to the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Center. This is the first time I've been to Douglas many a times, but I've never been in this building, so I'm really looking forward to, after the talk, going down and exploring a little bit. So I'm a professor of comparative religion at Western, and I've specialized in what are kind of generically called new religious movements. It's what used to be called cults and sects back in the day, and of course we no longer use those terms. And specifically, I'm very interested in the United States and the different kinds of interesting new religious movements that pop up. And so my latest project is on Dr. James Martin Peebles, who was a spiritualist, and here he is in profile. And what I'd like to do first is talk a little bit about what spiritualism was all about. How many people have heard of spiritualism? Okay, good, yeah, okay. Kind of a little primer on spiritualism, and then talk about how Dr. John Harvey Kellogg fits into that kind of spiritualist world. And the reason I call it the spiritualist century of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg is because he lived from 1822 to 1922. Almost, didn't quite make it, almost 100 years, which is kind of mirrors the trajectory of spiritualism in this country. So, the religion of spiritualism. Now, we always think of seances and mediums as being a part of spiritualism, which exactly it is. But it also was a religious movement that had its institutions and publications, and it was a big deal in much of the 19th century and had a tremendous impact beyond simply the people who believed in spiritualism. So it influenced art and literature, to some degree politics, because spiritualists were great reformers. So it was an important movement in its day. And it's based, of course, on the idea that the living can actually communicate with the spirits of the dead. And that was important because this is a time in the 19th century where people are beginning to doubt the religious traditions, mainly Christianity, that they were born into, and in part because of the rise of science. So a lot of people were looking for objective evidence that there was an afterlife and that people actually could survive death into the afterlife. And so for some, this was a tremendously important indication that this was real, it was empirical, or so they believed. For a time, it was one of the fastest growing religions in the 19th century. And again, it just had a tremendous impact beyond just simply the people who believed in it. So it traditionally dates from 1848 with these two sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox. They lived in a little tiny cabin in upstate New York outside of Rochester, a place called Hydesville. And at a certain point, they were sleeping up in the loft, and they began hearing knockings and noises in this cabin. And so almost instantly they believed, okay, this place is haunted. But instead of fleeing the scene, they started playing with it, and they came up with a way, they believed, that they could actually communicate with whoever was making all the knocks and noises. And this was an incredibly laborious process by which they basically asked yes/no questions, and the spirit, who they decided that it was a spirit, would answer with, one tap or two taps or things like that. When they left this little cabin, it turned out that the spirits followed them. And wherever they went, there were tapping or knocking noises in whatever building or place they were. And of course, a lot of people thought, okay, this is fraud. They're making these noises themselves. But a lot of people believe that, yes, this is actually the spirits talking to them. And they became friends with a couple of Quakers, Amy and Isaac Post. And they devised a way of a little bit more easily talking to the spirits. They came up with an alphabet board, which was just a piece of board that had the alphabet written out on it. And they would go with a stick and they would go A, B, C, D, click. Okay, word starts with C. And then they'd go on and they'd build up words and then sentences with this incredibly kind of laborious process. Well, after 1848, this idea that the spirits talk to people, and specifically certain people called mediums, caught on, and it became a kind of craze in the 1850s. And it very early developed that you didn't have to, use the alphabet board to communicate. You could also, mediums could do automatic writing. They're essentially channeling the words of the spirit. Or some, in trances, could actually speak the words of the spirits through them. Okay, and this is what people believed, or at least spiritualists at this time believed. And of course, the centerpiece of all this was the medium and the seance, the spiritualist circle. And people would get together in their homes with a number of people around a table, and typically there would be a medium, and mediums were typically, not always, but typically women, because the ideology of the day was that women were weak and vacillating, and they essentially were great vehicles for the spirits to take over and to communicate. Yeah, and so it became one of the first real kinds of professions that women could do beyond just simply like school teaching or things like that. So 1850s becomes a popular craze, but it also has a kind of intellectual heft to it because it acquires a theologian in this guy named Andrew Jackson Davis. And he's known as the Poughkeepsie Seer, since he was from Poughkeepsie, New York. And he would go into trances and claim that he could travel into the spirit world and come back and basically narrate what he had seen. And he wrote these tremendously long books describing everything in the spiritualist cosmos. And a lot of people found these things convincing. And so a lot of Andrew Jackson Davis's ideas became part and parcel of the spiritualist movement. So this is the title page of the Great Harmonia, which was a series of, I think, 12 volumes that he wrote in a trance. And this is just one of many books that he wrote over his fairly long lifetime. So this religion of spiritualism is beginning to coalesce in the 1850s and then the 1860s. One of the ideas that Davis had was that the universe, the cosmos, is actually a series of concentric spheres, 7 in number. The Earth would be racing around this outside here, and then when people died, their spirits would go to the second sphere. And the second sphere was actually so close to Earth, that's why people could actually communicate with spirits. But over time, the idea was that the afterlife was a place of continual education. Yeah, and people would evolve spiritually, and as they did, they would rise from the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth to the sixth sphere, and in that case, they would actually be in the presence of God, or as Andrew Jackson Davis called it, the sensorium, which was kind of his term for a kind of, non-anthropomorphic God. So this idea of the spheres and that people could actually communicate, at least with the lower spheres, before people had become spiritually developed. And that was sometimes used as an excuse for why what the spirits had to say was sometimes pretty banal. It's like, okay, because they haven't progressed yet, and we can't really communicate with the higher spheres where they have. So that's one of the reasons why some of the things the spirits say is pretty silly. So the second sphere he called the Summerland. And the Summerland was literally this kind of band around the cosmos, and people lived on this band, and they lived in houses. There were forests and flowers. It was like a technicolor version of the Earth, except there was no sickness, there was no death, there was no strife. Yeah, and people could continually learn throughout their period in the Summerland. Families would be reconstituted, marriages would hold, and it essentially would be a great reunion over time. So families would find themselves and reunite. And this was very comforting for people in the 19th century because death was omnipresent, infant mortality was high, and here was a promise that after death, the family would be reconstituted. So a couple of differences with the traditional Christian notion of the afterlife. For one thing, there was no hell for spiritualists. Everybody was saved. It didn't mean that everybody started at the same spiritual level in the second sphere, but everybody eventually, over time, eons of time, would rise to the highest sphere and be in the presence of God. Yeah. So in the 50s and 60s, in addition to the seance and the medium and this kind of theological heft that was beginning to this movement, it was also beginning to be institutionalized. So spiritualist churches were being formed. And if you have a church, you need to sing hymns. So people began basically producing hymnals specifically for spiritualists, which typically it had the traditional tunes with spiritualist messages in the words. These things are really very interesting. You probably can't read this in the back, but this is the constitutions of local societies and county circles of spiritualists in the state of Michigan. Michigan was a hotbed of spiritualism. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But this was an attempt to basically put a kind of statewide organization in place to basically bring spiritualists together and strengthen the spiritualist churches in Michigan. The problem is spiritualists tended to be such individualists that their organizations never lasted. They did not survive. Yeah, there was no pope of spiritualism. There was no, there was a kind of clergy, but they had no kind of authority over other spiritualists. So it was a kind of anarchic group of people. And their attempts to institutionalize were not terribly successful. There was also a large number of spiritualist newspapers that popped up throughout the country. This is the most famous. This was the Banner of Light out of Boston. And it actually lasted into the 20th century. Began in the 1860s and lasted into the 20th century. It was the most popular spiritualist newspaper. But there was one out of Chicago called the Religio Philosophical Journal, which also lasted, I think, into the 1890s. Spiritualism was exported from the United States to England and became very popular. And this is a spiritualist newspaper, the Medium and Daybreak. So one way of bringing together spiritualists, other than kind of institutions and bodies, was through this print culture, which was terribly important. So books, pamphlets, magazines, newspapers. And these were read not only by spiritualists, but also people who are just kind of interested in spiritualism, or maybe went to a seance out of curiosity. One of the problems with the history of spiritualism in the United States is it's very difficult to actually get accurate numbers of the number of people who were spiritualists. The spiritualists themselves said there was 11 million spiritualists in the United States by the 1860s, and that doesn't seem likely. By the 1880s and 90s, when they did religious census in this country, there were about 45,000. So we're probably talking about maybe 100,000 people who were spiritualists at any one time, and that is committed spiritualists, not simply people who showed up at seances. So it was a small movement, but it was a influential movement. One of the best things they did was they borrowed the idea of a camp meeting from the evangelical groups. So Methodists and Baptists. So the Methodists and Baptists pioneered this idea of having camp meetings where people would come to a forest or a grove, and they would camp out, and there would be ministers speaking, and people would basically camp in tents for maybe a weekend or a week, or sometimes these things lasted even longer. And over time, these became institutionalized as formal camps, and people built houses, and it would be a destination they would go to, say, every summer. They'd go to these things. Bayview Assembly up in Petoskey is an example. That's a Methodist one, I believe. Yeah, and it's still there. Well, the spiritualists liked this idea, and they also began camp meetings of their own. This is at Lake Pleasant, that's in Massachusetts. But closer to home, there was a camp meeting that was in Vicksburg, Michigan, for decades. And it was so popular that it actually influenced the creation of a camp meeting down in Indiana called Camp Chesterfield. And Camp Chesterfield is outside of Anderson, Indiana. And it's still in business to this day. Yeah, you can go down there and basically pay a medium and have a seance and talk to the spirits, among many other things that they do down there too. Yeah, there are two others in this country that still survive: Lilydale in upstate New York, and Casadaga, which is outside of Tampa in Florida. So this is a little bit of background. Of spiritualism to contextualize this guy, James Martin Peebles. So Peebles was born in Vermont. His family very early on moved to upstate New York, which was kind of the hotbed of all these new religious movements in the United States. Mormonism came out of upstate New York. Varieties of Shakers came out of upstate New York. The Oneida Perfectionists, et cetera, and spiritualism as well. Peebles, however, trained for the ministry, and he became a Universalist minister. And the Universalist Church taught that God would not damn anybody. Nobody was going to hell. Everybody would be saved. Yeah. And the Universalist tradition today, in the 60s, it actually merged with the Unitarians. So it's now the Unitarian Universalist Church. But Universalism used to be a separate denomination. And the key teaching was that God would save everyone. Very popular among certain circles. So he becomes a Universalist minister. He's very good in the pulpit. He's got a great presence. He's like 6'4", got a booming voice, a great kind of pulpit style, and he becomes very popular. However, shortly after 1848, he began experimenting with spiritualism himself. And it turns out that Universalist ministers in particular were uniquely susceptible to spiritualism. And it's still a kind of a conundrum why. But he was one of many, and eventually he reads Andrew Jackson Davis. He's convinced that Davis has had these experiences and what he's narrating is true. And he begins to incorporate these ideas into his Universalist sermons, which is popular with some of his parishioners, not with others. There's a lot of tension. Eventually, he gets a pulpit in Baltimore, Maryland, a Universalist church in Baltimore, Maryland. And the tensions escalate, not only because of the spiritualism, but also because Peebles is an abolitionist in essentially a slave city. Yeah. So at a certain point, he says, I resign. He resigned the pulpit. He left the Universalist Church. At that point, he didn't really know what he wanted to do. So he went to Wisconsin, where he had a relative who was in the real estate business. They tried that for a little while. Peebles was terrible at selling real estate. So he doesn't know what he's going to do. So he decides, I'm going to go back to upstate New York, where he had left his wife. But on the way, he gets an invitation to stop by Battle Creek, Michigan. And the reason he stops by Battle Creek, Michigan is because he's got a good friend, a guy named Jason P. Averill, who is also one of these Universalist ministers who has given up Universalism and become a spiritualist. And so he says, we have a very interesting church here that you might be interested in taking a look at. And it turns out Battle Creek has a very, very interesting religious history. Probably everybody knows Seventh-day Adventism began in Battle Creek in the 1860s. But even before that, it was a Quaker town. And especially Hicksite Quakers, which were these liberal Quakers who were into all sorts of reform. Women's rights, abolition, the reform of prisons, peace, all these kinds of things the Quakers were interested in. Eventually, the Quakers decided that they were going to open up their doors to everybody else in town who was interested in these ideas as well, and they were going to create a group they called the Progressionists. And this is actually the broadside of the Progressionists, basically telling people what they believe. And so they brought in people from a variety of different religious traditions to create the Independent Church of Battle Creek, Michigan, 1866. Now, when spiritualism came on the scene, they grabbed that as well. And in time, spiritualism began to dominate the Independent Church of Battle Creek. And that's why Averill wanted Peebles to come to Battle Creek, because Averill wanted to leave the church because he wanted to go into business, but he wanted to have a minister in place to take his place. And so Peebles said, sure. And so from 1857, Peebles was a lecturer, a spiritualist lecturer, to the Independent Church of Battle Creek. Now, the good thing about this job was he only had to lecture twice a week on weekends. The rest of the time, he was constantly on the road throughout Southwest Michigan and a lot of the Midwest, preaching spiritualism. So, for example, there was a very strong spiritualist church down in Sturgis, of all places. Yeah, and so he would go down during the week and basically lecture. So he was constantly on the road, and he was so peripatetic that he got this, this nickname as the Spiritual Pilgrim. Yeah, and it was almost pathological with Peebles. He had to be on the road. He had to travel. He was incredibly restless, and this forms a real interesting part of his life. After 10 years, he decides he no longer wants a regular pulpit job, so he moves his family to Hammonton, New York, which was New Jersey, rather, which was a spiritualist town, where he could basically spend his time writing for newspapers. He had a regular column in the Banner of Light, but also writing books. And the one on the left is called Seers of the Ages, which is kind of the best known book that he produced during this period. And it's a kind of work of comparative religion, and he's trying to convince you that spiritualism is the original religion of mankind. And if you go back through history, you'll find elements of spiritualism going back to the most basic, or as he would put it, primitive religions. And this was an argument that really resonated with a lot of spiritualists. This isn't a new tradition that popped up in 1848. It's just a continuation. It's the modern version of an ancient tradition. So this book, Seers of the Ages, became terribly popular. He also wrote a book called Jesus, Myth, Man, or God, which became terribly controversial. Because his argument here was that Jesus was nothing other than a spiritualist medium. And how do you know this? Well, he was always basically in a trance, basically channeling God and his angels, but he was also going around the countryside healing people psychically. And where does that power come from? Where does that magnetism come from? That was the term they used. Well, he basically channeled the spiritual energy from the afterlife into himself, and through the laying on of hands, he could spiritually, magnetically, again, that was the term they used, heal people of any disease. This kind of psychic healing was tremendously popular. And of course, this was just tremendously controversial, and Peebles loved a good theological fight, so it sold lots of books. Well, again, he's a traveler. He wants to be on the road. And after a few years in Hammonton, New Jersey, he's written his books. He decides, I want to go overseas. So he applies for a consulship. And he wants to go to Jerusalem. He wants the U.S. consulship in Jerusalem. And consuls, they're not ambassadors. Consuls basically are people in important cities that basically try to, facilitate U.S. trade. They're typically in port cities, but they could be other places as well. And so facilitate trade, but also, for example, if U.S. sailors get thrown in jail, the consul is always called in to basically bail them out and get them back on their ship, those kinds of things. It was an unpaid position, and the only way you could make money was to charge fees. So you had to be very entrepreneurial. And I'm not sure if Peebles really knew what he was getting into when he applied for this. Well, they didn't give him Jerusalem. They gave him Trebizond, Turkey, which is a tiny town on the Black Sea. Yeah, it's in the back of beyond. And so people said, great. He left his wife in Hammonton, New Jersey. That becomes a kind of leitmotif in his life. His wife basically stays at home and he goes off traveling. It's not really clear whether he actually made it to Trebizond. The dates don't quite add up, but he was in Constantinople, and he remained there long enough for Congress to basically approve his consulship. And that was important because he had it in the back of his mind that he wanted to travel the world. And if you were a U.S. consul, even somebody who had resigned, you still could call on U.S. consuls throughout the globe and get their hospitality. So I'm not sure whether this was something it was a strategy of his, but that's how it worked out. Because he wasn't a consul for very long, although he used the title consul for years. A few years later, he launches onto his first world tour, which was in the 1870s being facilitated by the fact that you had the British Empire, which is all these red bits. And so it was very easy for Peebles to travel in the British Empire because you had English speakers. Transportation was good. He also had the marvelous Cook's tours that he could take, so he took advantage of those. So he traveled to places like Australia and India and Egypt and South Africa, all sorts of different places. And he made his living lecturing to spiritualist groups in each one of these places. So it gives you an idea of the kind of global spread of spiritualism, at least within the English-speaking world. He gets back. He begins writing a series of books about his travels. The first one is called Around the World Travels in China, India, Arabia, Egypt, and Other Heathen Countries. Now, the important thing is, heathen is in quotes here, because his argument is these people aren't heathens at all. They are proto-spiritualists, and they belong within the family of spiritualism. So what is interesting is that logo on the front of the book looks a whole lot like the Cook's Tours logo. Yeah. Well, over his life, he traveled around the world 5 times, and every few world trips, he would go back and revise his book, 3 journeys around the world, and then eventually 5 journeys around the world. And apparently these were, I don't know if they were bestsellers, but they sold enough that he could make a living, or something of a living, off of these books. Okay. Not one to sit on his laurels. He decides he now wants to become a doctor. And this is in the 1870s. He was always fascinated with psychic healing. He had some medical training as a kid, But in 1876, he graduated from the Philadelphia University of Medicine and Surgery, which sounds very impressive, except it's a diploma mill, and it's not clear if he ever actually took a course in medicine. Yeah. It was notorious. There's a wonderful book about just how notorious this place was. What he studied was called eclectic medicine, and this was a recognized category of medicine. So regular doctors would use surgery and drugs to treat disease. Eclectics, they would use anything out there that they thought worked, including psychic healing. So that's why Peebles was so interested in being an eclectic doctor. He then, again, he needs to travel. He goes on the road in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states from city to city, gets a hotel room, publishes an ad in the paper. This is Pennsylvania Hall. Where exactly was that? Pottsville, thank you. Yeah, one of these little tiny towns. And he would stay there a week. People would come. He would do his psychic healings. They would pay him. He'd move on. And he did this for years. He also was inspired by his friend from Battle Creek, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And he created his own series of sanitariums. So John Harvey Kellogg, of course, created the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which became this international institution, tremendously important in its day. And Peebles said, well, if he can do that, I can do that too. And so he created a sanitarium in Hammonton, closed that, moved to San Antonio. That burned to the ground in 1896, so he moves on to San Diego. And these aren't sanitariums like John Harvey Kellogg Sanitarium. This is more like a kind of rest home or nursing home where invalids would come and pay rent, and it was kind of like a boarding house for invalids. But he would also treat them through a variety of means, including psychic healing. Yeah. Now, California at this time was a tremendous destination for him because there was a vibrant health culture in Los Angeles and San Diego, because these two towns had basically attracted wealthy Midwesterners, mainly farmers who wanted to retire in the sun. And they all tended to be rather old. So they had various ailments. And they're developed in Southern California, a very strong kind of health culture, and he fit right into that, He created a publishing company. He published a book called Death Defeated, The Psychic Secret of How to Keep Young, which was just one of his many books and pamphlets about how you can basically live a very long life. And most of it was pretty basic stuff that he cribbed from John Harvey Kellogg. You know, eat a vegetarian diet, don't drink alcohol, don't smoke tobacco, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, avoid condiments, those kinds of things. But also there was a strong component of kind of the power of positive thinking and psychic healing. He also published a book called Compulsory Vaccination, a Menace to Personal Liberty. Yeah, and he believed, like anti-vaxxers do today, that vaccines do not work, that they pollute the body with foreign material, and that it's undemocratic if anybody is forced to actually be vaccinated. And sadly, this is a book that is still being quoted today among anti-vaxxers. Yeah. He didn't start the anti-vax movement that was bigger than him, but unfortunately he contributed to it. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a doctor here vaccinating a person who's been tied up and he's held by a policeman. It's not a subtle book. He also created a newspaper, of course, called the Temple of Health. And that basically advertised his books and his sanitariums. Well, he didn't stop there. He went in business with a guy named Dr. Burrows, and again, doctor in quotes here, this guy here, in Indianapolis, and he created the Peebles and Burrows Health Company. And there they promised psychic cures. You could either come in person, have them lay hands on you, be cured, or Peebles claimed that he could heal people at a distance. All you had to do was send him a postcard and $1 or $5 with your symptoms. He would send you back a date and a time when he, from Indianapolis, would tune into you wherever you were and cure your disease. Yeah. And that was incredibly lucrative. So lucrative that the regular doctors of Indianapolis got together and they kicked these guys out of town. So where did they go? Battle Creek. Doctors Peebles and Burrows, successful specialists in chronic diseases, are located in Battle Creek. That they have the largest, finest, and most complete offices in the United States, which are devoted exclusively to the treatment and cure of chronic, nervous, and private diseases. Send name, age, sex, and a leading symptom and receive an absolutely correct diagnosis free, which they would do. You've got gallstones or whatever. But then if you wanted to be cured, they'd also send you a pamphlet that had all the, the books and pamphlets and psychic cures and stuff that you could buy to actually cure yourself. This was a tremendously successful business. So successful, I guess at a certain point, Burrows and Peebles quarreled and they split up. And Peebles reorganized as the Peebles Institute of Health of Battle Creek, Michigan. And it was so lucrative that he turned it into a public corporation and sold stock in 1902. Yeah, so he was a pretty good businessman when it came to these kinds of things. But you can see, again, cured by psychic power, psychic diagnosing, startling cures by a Battle Creek man. Well, eventually, the federal government caught up to him, and he was convicted of mail fraud. 1902, convicted of mail fraud. There's an account of the trial, which was held in Detroit, and apparently the prosecutor went up to Peebles and said, "Do you really think you have the healing power of Jesus Christ?" And Peebles apparently stood up, and by this time he had this giant patriarchal beard. He was still, he was 6'4". And he basically said to the open court in this booming voice, and he looks up and he says, "If God hasn't given me this power of Jesus Christ to heal, let him strike me dead." And then there was just quiet for about a minute. And he goes, "Well, there you go." They convicted him anyway. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what the penalty was, some kind of fine, but he wasn't thrown into jail or anything like that. This was mail fraud. I'm not sure what the penalties were. But they stopped advertising psychic cures and instead turned to the very lucrative line of patent medicines. Oh, boy. Yeah. So he had 2 epilepsy cures. He had this thing called herbivine compound, mainly for female disorders, and a variety of other kind of patent medicines, which typically had, well, this one, I love this, it says, you probably can't see this, contains not over 11% alcohol. So, oh, okay. And then he says below, necessary as a preservative and a solvent. Yeah, well, okay. This was tremendously, tremendously lucrative. And again, you could send a postcard to him, Dr. Peebles Institute of Health, request a catalog, and they would send you these medicines. And the interesting thing about these medicines is not only did they have healing ingredients, but he also charged them with his own personal magnetism that he channeled from the spirits. And it was a kind of magnetic healing as well. For a time, he actually marketed something called magnetic papers, which were just tissue papers, a stack of tissue papers that he had supposedly charged with his personal animal magnetism, and you would then place them on wherever you were ailed, and the magnetism would basically transfer and cure you of your disease. It's kind of hard to believe that people bought these things. Well, it's not hard to believe that people bought the alcohol. Yeah. But things like magnetic papers, maybe there was a very strong placebo effect going on. It's hard to tell. Yeah. But it was so lucrative that he eventually retired in 1910. settled in Los Angeles because, again, Los Angeles had this health culture. He let the business basically run itself. He had a protege, a guy named Dr. Bobo, who ran the company for a while. Yes, Dr. Bobo. He was the man who introduced golf to Battle Creek, of all things. Yeah, in addition to running Peebles Institute of Health. Peebles had early on, a couple of decades before, written a book called How to Live a Century and Grow Old Gracefully. Well, he was getting close to that century mark. And so in Los Angeles, he became a kind of professional old person. He would be interviewed by the papers. They'd ask him, what's the secret for a long life? And he'd tell them, you know, I don't eat meat, I get lots of exercise, you know, I'm power of positive thinking, those kinds of things. He was an organizer of something called the Centenarian Group, which brought together people who were 90 years old and above in Los Angeles as a kind of social group. And you can see him here in the background. There's Dr. Peebles. And this was notable enough that National Geographic actually did a little article on it back in 1919. He also kept his hand in spiritualism. He lectured to spiritualist groups. He tried to create what he called the College of Science, which was a kind of eclectic medical school. Never really went that far, but an interesting project. So he was doing his medicine. He was doing his kind of, gerontology, if you want to call it that, and also his spiritualism. Well, he finally passed away in Los Angeles on February 15th, 1922, 4 months shy of his 100th birthday. Almost made it. And it's interesting, if you look at the newspapers across the country, they carried this as news. Yeah, you'll find all sorts of little squibs that basically note the fact that he almost made it. Dr. Peebles almost made it. Well, his friends, his spiritualist friends, decided that if he couldn't make it to his 100th birthday, they would invite his spirit. And so it's also made national news. Did Dr. Peebles' ghost come to the birthday dinner? Yeah. Peebles was friends with a medium named Guy Bogart. And Bogart arranged for this birthday dinner. And of course, since he was the medium, he could actually see when the spirits came. And he was telling people, yes, Dr. Peebles is in the room. Here he is sitting in this empty chair. Yeah, and he has all sorts of good things to say about the afterlife, especially he no longer has rheumatism. So, it's interesting that Dr. Peebles continues to be a spirit that is routinely channeled by spiritualists even to this day, which is kind of interesting. Even though a lot of people who channel him obviously don't know much about him because he comes back speaking in a Scottish brogue. No, he had a Yankee Vermont accent, very nasal, yeah. So a tremendously influential person within the world of spiritualism, and spiritualism itself was tremendously influential, at least into the early 20th century, although pockets of spiritualism still survive to this day. So I will leave it there. Thanks for listening.